So essentially, the neutron will want to go through beta decay and to decay into a proton and electron and emit light while it does this. As it's doing this, it's going to have a blue spectrum, and this thing will be blue. And essentially, at the very end, it'll turn into a whitest. At the very hottest it'll get is white, and then it'll end up dying. And it'll emit copies of itself that'll decay into protons and electrons, ultimately creating neutrons, protons, and electrons, which will create atoms. But as it goes through this process here, it's decaying and it's still emitting these particles. It's essentially decaying into a gigantic atom, and it'll invert. The outside will collapse into a core here, and it'll inflate. It'll invert itself. And it'll turn into a giant atom, essentially. Because as it emits these particles, all the electrons are going to go to a photosphere, and the protons are going to be pulled toward this neutral core, or the polar core, essentially, or positive core. And you're going to get an imbalance of neutrons, protons, and electrons. There's essentially going to be more protons and electrons than neutrons. And we see that, meaning there were more neutrons in the beginning because each neutron became a proton and an electron. And still with almost just as many protons and electrons and neutrons, even though neutrons are behind, there were still more because these guys came from the neutron. And neutron and proton, neuter of protos. And that's what neutron means, which again reverts back to the Greek because it's all Greek. So the cradle, which is X, decays in going through alpha decay, which is your nuclear energy, your neutron, that goes through its beta decay, becoming the proton and electrons. And when the universe does this, like I was saying, we get half of what happens to us from the universe, and our bodies, the other half of cells themselves, that inherited from our mother, like eukaryotic. Essentially, it inverts here, just like in the same way. So as it's a giant neutron, it essentially goes through its beta decay and forms a giant atom. And it spews small copies of protons, neutrons, and electrons into space with an imbalance. See here, 85 to 86% protons with an equal number of electrons and just 14 to 15% neutrons. But you have to think that all those protons and electrons came from neutrons. And it's a giant cosmic carbon-based organism because it's going through a thermal process. And keeping in mind that all life that we know is either endothermic or exothermic correlates to this factor. That the universe itself, though it is thermic, and we see it as just some random thing, it actually is a living organism. Look, when you look inside yourself and you see cells working,
Can't see them. Trillions of cells within our work together to give us the gift of life. These tiny units of life fascinate biologists like Boyce Rensberger.
Now the point here is that even though all this looks like random things happening, like we look up and see random things happening in the universe, when you're on the inside of it, that's how it looks. It looks like random things, random occurrences. But when you get on the broader picture of it, all of those little random occurrences and simple structures make up one large complex structure. It's all about the microcosm and a macrocosm. This is exactly how this works, except for, again, it's pseudoscience. But the fact is, how can they explain this then without that pseudoscience? It's just a label that we give something to lend no credence to it, to take value away from it. And it's not us that does it, it's they. And again, with the Greek, the spore here is Uranus, and Gaia is the earth. So we're half earth and half Uranus. Because when Uranus hits the water and it starts growing into the things in the ocean, the mycelial networks, the fungus and the coral and cnidarians, that's Neptune. The life in the oceans begins, and that's Neptune. And since these mollusks here, when these put these together, as I was saying, we're related to the earth, and the mollusks are related to the earth, and that's why they have a mantle and a crust, which is essentially a shell. That's hermaphrodite, because they are hermaphrodites, and that's hermaphrodite. So it does revert to the Greek if you know how to look at it. It's not that these things are like people and all this, and it's just they have made us believe and know what they want us to believe and know. And if we start looking at it like this, everything that I've put out here completely debunks them saying what they're saying. It's completely contrary to what they're telling us. But all the science and all the stuff that we can look for ourselves literally does, if we ask the right questions, can prove what they're telling us is wrong. They give us all the answers. At the same time, they change what it means by suggesting things that they think it means. Like the ichthyosaur, for example. They give you every indication in the science and its biology that it's a mammal. But then they tell you, or they lead you to believe, that it's a reptile, ultimately giving you the choice to believe them or say, well, I don't know. You just told me that thing represents a cetacean more than any kind of reptile, so how could that be, you know? And if it does have reptilian features, it would be a proto-cetacean, technically. And especially claiming that mammals evolved from reptiles. So all the evidence they give us supports us coming out of the water, but they lead us to believe that we went back in the water. See, where did Ambulocetus, the walking whale, come from? It just popped into existence. Literally, and if you do all the research, that's what they have, this popping into existence. And then evolving into the water, into the whales. But wait, how did it evolve onto the land? Where did it come from on the land in the first place that it evolved into the water? You got to give me some proof and something that is not ridiculous, okay? And then try to convince me otherwise. It's not going to work. And that's how I look at the scientific community right now. Because I happen to know that what births is water. The menstrual cycle, like I mentioned with the saline and the waters, wetness, birth, where the ocean meets the land is birth. The waters of space, the cradle of life. The waters birth the life. And that's not contrary to anything. That's what we can prove. And though it sounds like pseudoscience, I don't see how this is pseudoscience. We can prove this stuff. It's ultimately the stuff we can prove with a perspective that makes more sense. And that's why what I'm saying sounds so contrary to what they're telling us. It's because they are being contrary. It's because they're giving us misinformation. They're leading us to believe something that's untrue, contrary to what we should instinctively know. They're hiding the truth right in front of us is what I'm saying. Evolution, people want to understand evolution, it's right in front of us. I'm telling you, we evolved from the whales. And I hate to be, so passionate about it, but I believe that this could solve a lot of problems, and especially when it comes to understanding the patterns and isolating genes to treat diseases. Because we can understand where these diseases come from and what genes helped aid in formation of which part of the animal.